One of the legal experts heard the Sadducees disputing with Jesus and saw how well he answered them. He came over and asked Jesus, "Which commandment is the most important of all?" Jesus replied, quoting Deuteronomy and Leviticus, "The most important one is, 'Israel, listen. Our God is the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all of your being, with all your mind, and with all of your strength.' And the second is this: you will love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these." The legal expert said to him, "Well said, teacher. You have truthfully said that God is one and there is no other besides him. And to love God with all your heart, all full understanding, and all of one's strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more important than all kinds of entirely burned offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered with wisdom, he said to him, "You aren't far from God's kingdom." After that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. The word of the Lord. Let's join together in singing hymn 62. One of my all-time favorite musicians is a singer-songwriter that's based out of Louisville, Kentucky. He is an indie artist who plays the cello and sings at the same time. His name is Ben Sollee. Ben has taken to doing tours of his concerts in a way that's completely different from any other artist I've heard of. Most musicians normally travel from concert to concert by cargo van or bus. But because of Ben's love for the environment and the destruction he's seen in his native Appalachia, he books tours in towns that are a bikeable distance from one another and does his tours by bike. His manager sets this up, and then he and his percussionist bandmate load up their cargo bicycles with their instruments in tow and their luggage, and they hit the road. He's done 2 or 3 bike tours now in his career. And at his concerts, sometimes, in the transitional time between songs, he shares of some of his experience about this different way of touring. He says there's something different about car travel, that when we're in cars, it forces us to speed up. When we're in cars, we go so fast, and the way cars are designed, and the way that roads and highways are built, it's like you're closed off from the world around you. You're flying past neighborhoods, totally unaware that there's a community there at all, totally unaware that there are people living there, totally closed off and unaware of the life that's happening beyond yourself. He's realized there's something different about traveling at bike speed. It forces you to slow down. You're exposed to your environment in a completely different way. You aren't isolated from your world, but you're forced to interact with it. And more importantly for Binso Lee, at bike speed, you're forced to interact with the people around you. You aren't isolated from them. He shares a story about this one time where he was riding through a part of town that looked pretty sketchy. He put his guard up a little bit and was starting to feel nervous about his surroundings. And then he rode up to a stop sign with a group of kids playing, and it instantly diffused his nerves. The kids started running alongside of his bike and asking him all kinds of questions. You can imagine they weren't used to seeing white dudes on bikes in that part of town, let alone cargo bikes with an odd-looking cello case mounted alongside of it. One of the kids asked if he could hop on, and Ben let him. He rode along for 2 blocks with a wide smile on his face before hopping off because he had to head back home. He says one thing that every community he rides through has in common is that whenever he talks to the local people there and tells them where he's heading after he leaves them, they always warn him about the next town over. They say, "You be safe there. I've heard that's a pretty rough and dangerous neighborhood." Or they say, "You be safe there in that suburb. There's too many cars on the road and people are not paying attention. It's not a good place for a bicycle." And then he says, without fail, he goes into that next town over there. He rides through it slowly, at bike speed. He interacts with the people there, and they always welcome him warmly. Again and again this happens. It doesn't matter the neighborhood, rich or poor, suburb or housing project, the same incorrect assumptions take place about the next town over. The same fear about the place and people that people never interacted with before. It's the same judgment about a people they've never even met. Which begs the question, how well do we really know our neighbors? And how can we love them if we've never made the effort to know them? I'd like to invite you to do something that we don't normally do during a sermon. Participate. You will have no doubt already found the insert in your bulletin, and I want to invite you to take a second and open it up. In this insert, there is a gridded diagram, and this grid is an exercise that comes from the book, The Art of Neighboring. It's a book that was written to a Christian audience that explores a radical idea. What if, when Jesus says the commandment, "You will love your neighbor as you love yourself," what if he meant what he said? What if he meant that we should start with loving our actual neighbors? The book suggests this grid as a starting place. It invites us to begin a practice of loving our neighbors by first figuring out how well we know them. You can start to fill it out now if you like, but it will most likely take more time than I'm going to give you today. So I hope you take it home and continue to think about it a little more intentionally later. The house at the center of the grid represents your home looking out your front door. And the grid of 8 squares around your house represents the houses of the people that live closest to you, your neighbors. You begin this exercise with your neighbors' names, going square by square and writing all the names that you can think of down. Then you write down some basic information about them that you could have figured out from observation. How many kids they have, whether or not they have pets, how obsessive they are about their lawn care routine. And then you jump down to the final step for each of your neighbors. You write down something deeper about them that you could have only learned through conversation. You write down a piece of their story. You write down what makes them who they are, what makes them unique and complex creatures of God. We have lived in our house for 5 years now, and in filling out our grid, I was only able to put information in 5 of the 8 squares. And in those 5 that I could fill in, I still left some of that information blank. A legal scholar asked Jesus what the most important commandment is of all the commandments in the Hebrew Bible. And Jesus answers with 2 things. 2 things that are more important than anything else. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and being and mind and strength. And love your neighbor as you love yourself. One of the 2 most important commandments in the whole Bible. And I struggle to remember the names of 4 of my 8 neighbors. It turns out that this is becoming more and more the norm for most people in the world. According to a 2015 social data survey, only about 20% of Americans say they spend any time with their neighbors. And nearly a third of the population reports no interaction whatsoever with the people who live nearby, which is a total reversal of the way things were only 4 decades ago, in the 70s, when nearly 30% of Americans reported hanging out with their neighbors at least twice a week. So I imagine if these statistics are accurate, I bet I'm not the only one in this room who will find blank spaces on my grid. Loving our neighbors, I think, is an easy thing for us to sign up for when it's a theoretical exercise. It's easy to love someone when nothing is being asked of you. It's easy to love neighbors in the abstract when they are faceless, unnamed strangers. But when you move from the theoretical to the practical and consider the possibility that Jesus is asking us to begin to love our neighbors by actually loving the 8 neighbors in these grids, these people with names and faces and stories, it becomes a lot more real and a lot more complicated. It forces us to ask questions of ourselves. How could I have lived next to these people for so long and know so little about them? How could I be so closed off from my world and unaware of the lives happening around me? And if this commandment is one of the most important things that Jesus says we should do, that as his followers, how might my relationship with my neighbors become more loving? I think Jesus would say, why don't you start off by getting to know them? Why don't you try to set aside your assumptions and set aside your fears? Why don't you get out of your closed world of only your life and interact with the outer environment that you live in? Why don't we open ourselves up, set ourselves aside for a while, and seek to be in relationship with the people that God has placed in our lives? Because as Jesus says, beyond our loving God, nothing could be more important. May it be so in each of your houses and in mine, and may it be so this week and beyond as we love those around us.